Welcome to EPC Conversations for another episode. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm delighted today to be joined by a friend and guest, Reverend Neil Macmillan. Neil is a minister in the Free Church. He's based in Edinburgh, and I thought it would be really good to chat today to get perspective from somebody who's leading another church in another city and see what it's been like for them, and also see how much we've got in common in the church in Scotland today. So Neil, welcome. Thank you very much for joining me, and why don't you begin by telling us a bit about yourself and how you came to be the minister where you are.
Great. So my name is Neil Macmillan, and grew up in Glasgow. Went to Glasgow University, did a degree in politics, became a minister in the Free Church after that, studied theology after politics, and was a minister in Fife for a long time, 16 years in Kirkcaldy. And then I worked for my denomination, the Free Church, for 5 or 6 years, training leaders for mission. And then I planted a church in Edinburgh about 7 years ago called Cornerstone. So I've got 4 kids. Most of them are grown up now. I've got a teenage son. And my wife, Louise, has been a really great ministry partner all along. She has really worked alongside me and now is a biblical counsellor. So just helps people in crisis, trying to connect their lives to Scripture and see how the Bible can bring good change in their life in hard situations. So that's just a wee bit of what I'm up to or where I've come from. So. Yeah,
and what about in the early days? Because people who end up with a kind of call to ministry, they seem to take, there seems to be no two people that follow the same route. Could you tell us a bit more about the process, about how you discerned a call to firstly to steer others and train them for a mission, and then how that evolved into planting your own church, which doesn't happen a huge amount in Scotland today?
Not a huge amount. There is quite a lot of church planting going on, but a lot of it's from different ethnic minorities, and the majority of churches that are getting planted are African churches or from different sort of nationalities. So not so many Scots plant churches in Scotland. So a bit about how I ended up training people. Yeah, I think one of the great challenges in Scotland is just that there's been such a steep decline in engagement with Christianity and church that 3 or 4% of Scots are actively involved in church now, and we have to think of Scotland as a mission field. And to reach that mission field effectively, we really need a kind of multiplication effect. So we need to multiply disciples, we need to multiply leaders, and we need to multiply churches. There's lots of opportunity for mission out there. And so I just got very interested in how do we raise up the leaders that we need to do the mission that we want to do. And especially from my point of view, I'm very interested in starting new congregations. How do we raise up leaders for new churches and for church planting, as we call it? So that's where that came from. And we've been building a pipeline now over about 6 or 7 years, working with young leaders through boot camps and through training programs, just seeking to equip people who'll be lay leaders in churches or who will be part of a church plant launch team or who will themselves lead the church plant. So that's been really exciting. We've seen lots of really great young leaders coming through and planting different kinds of churches in a variety of situations. And not all of that happens within the Free Church. We have a little church planting network called Generation, where we kind of assess and train and coach church planters and find money for them. And we set that up in the Free Church, but to serve a wider group of people so that we could equip anybody who wants help to start a new church. We're willing to help them. So.
I think what's interesting in your conversation is that we have so much information in the 21st century, and there's no end of books and writing about how we address some of the crises that you've mentioned that we face in the church today in the West and Scotland particularly. But what's coming through and what you're saying is that church is foundational to everything that you are doing. And while we can rightly give thanks for so many other strategies and mission and outreach organizations, sounds like you have a real passion for actually the church has not gone anywhere, which might seem surprising because so often the talk is the church still relevant? So I'm saying that just to provoke you, because I'd like to hear a bit more about why you believe church is so central.
Well, I mean, it's first of all a theological conviction. Where do we make disciples? Where do we fulfill the Great Commission to go and make disciples, teach them to obey what Christ commands or baptize them? Well, that happens in the local church. So I think, like the local church is God's missionary plan for this world. And it's local churches that go out, do mission, meet with people, minister to people, help people, share the gospel and make disciples. So there are lots of great ways of connecting with people and doing evangelism and sharing the gospel and helping people in need. But ultimately, you want to tie all these back into a local church where people will be discipled and cared for. And there's a really definite structure of that in the New Testament. That Paul went out, planted churches, then he would go back and appoint leaders and strengthen and form what we would recognize as a local church in Colossae or, Thessaloniki or wherever it was. So we're just trying to kind of stick with the biblical pattern. Local churches are a great way of doing mission. And one of the tragedies, I think, for Scotland is that so many communities now lack a really healthy, gospel-driven, Bible-based local church. And we just want to give that back to local communities, because where you've got a healthy church, it's good for the local community. So.
And what has been then, you've put your money where your mouth is, and you've planted a church in Edinburgh. Tell us a bit about how you went about that and founding Cornerstone, and what the journey's been like for you guys.
So it's been great. I'd done a couple of churches. I replanted a church essentially in Kirkcaldy back in the early 90s, and that was brutal. It was a really difficult process and very slow, and I had no idea what I was doing. And then we planted another church from that in Dunfermline. And again, it was a really kind of pretty shonky process. It was like, we'll start a service, see who turns up, invite everybody we know. We hadn't really thought through strategy, leadership, how we were going to do evangelism, how we were going to do discipleship. So when I started working for my denomination about 10 years ago, I spent a lot of time with different church planting networks globally, like Acts 29 or City to City from Tim Keller's church in New York, and just trying to learn how good church planting is done and sort of imbibing a bit of their DNA. So I was living in Edinburgh and working for my denomination, but worshipping in a church called St. Columba's Free Church, which is in the centre of Edinburgh. And it had been revitalised over the previous 10 years. It was a church of 20 people. It had grown to about 120 or 150 people. And the minister is a great guy, Derek Lamont, and he had a vision like, how do we reach more widely into the city? And he and I both thought, well, church planting, starting new churches is a great way just to connect to different parts of the city. And I was leading a kind of home group or a small group in Morningside where we lived. There was about 12 of us, and we just thought, well, why don't I see if I can use that small group of people to start a new church in our part of the city? And there were several churches already in Morningside, so we were trying to get into a situation where there were fewer churches, so that didn't really work out for us. But there's 30,000 people in the area, and maybe 500 or 600 go to church. So we thought there's plenty of scope to reach people who don't come to church. So that was really our aim. We started a church for people who don't go to church. And church planting is not about moving people between different congregations, which is what can happen. It's about mission. It's saying, who doesn't know Jesus, who doesn't have the hope of the gospel, how can we reach these people? So when we started Cornerstone, we didn't advertise it because the only people who look at church websites are Christians, and we didn't want Christians to come to our church. And we had no notice board because we didn't want people to come that way. The only way you could come is if you were invited. And so we said to people, don't bring Christians with you, only bring non-Christians. And we used to have a little booklet that said, we give it out in the morning, the hymns and the songs and the readings. And we had a wee bit at the bottom, if you're visiting from another church, thanks for coming, but don't come back. So, but some people found offensive. But we really didn't want to be poaching people from other churches or just sort of moving Christians between one place and another. So we really wanted to find people who were not going to church and saying, maybe you can come here and find out more about Jesus. So it's been great. Loved it. It's been a really enjoyable process. Morningside's a very sweet place to plant a church. You know, it's very affluent and comfortable, and there's lots of nice cafes and restaurants, and everybody's very polite and civilized. So we've had a really easy time of it in some ways. God provided a church building for us that was gifted to us. And then we were gifted a manse in Morningside as well, where property is very expensive. So somebody gave us a huge amount of money to buy a manse for the church. And the congregation has grown sort of slowly but steadily. We haven't seen like hundreds of people come to faith, but just a trickle of people coming to faith every year. A lot of people who were burnt with church coming back. And we have, for some reason, a lot of Latino people in our church. So we had one Latino family who've brought another. So we have quite a strong Spanish language ministry now, which was totally surprising to us.
Yeah, and that obviously speaks to the fact that you're trying to reflect the culture and situation you find yourself in, rather than just do church the way perhaps we've always done it and hope people catch up. Because I was wanting to talk to you about that. If you were trying to plant a church for people that weren't already Christians, that weren't churched, and you were really looking to push the mission of Jesus where you are, how did that affect the way you went about things like structuring worship and preaching? You know, what did that look like in the nitty-gritty?
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of the church planter training that we do now is all about contextualization. You know, where are you planting this church? What are the people like? You know, what do they value? What music do they like? What books do they read? And what are their life goals and ambitions? And what's their thoughts about church and so on. So in Morningside, there were sort of three groups of people we found. The first group was quite transient, young professionals who rented in the community and moved on. The second group were older Edinburgh people who were sort of religious, very private, fairly wealthy. They'd lived in Morningside all their lives. And then there was a third group who we were more interested in, really, who were people who lived internationally. Maybe they were Scots who'd lived abroad, come back to settle in their 30s, start a family, or people from the States or Europe who'd come to Edinburgh. It's a nice city. People like to live there. There's a lot of good jobs in the finance sector or in health or in education. Edinburgh University attracts a lot of people. So those were the families that we were finding there, who were quite mobile, very intellectual, successful in life, like good things. And so what we did had to be really good, you know, because they value quality. So, you know, we said, we're never going to wing it. We're never going to do second best. We're always going to give our absolute best and the highest quality that we can deliver. So that was one thing we really went for. As we spoke to people and found out about, you know, so church planting involves a lot of demographics, but also what they call ethnography or anthropology. Just talking to people and finding out like their background, their stories, the things they value, the artifacts that they hold to, and so on. And we find a lot of the people religiously had a background either in Roman Catholicism or Anglican Episcopalian backgrounds. And so we were trying to then create something that would where they'd feel at home, I suppose, where they wouldn't come in and think, oh man, this is totally mental. So our free church services, if people know the Free Church of Scotland, it was very simple service, a sort of psalm, a prayer, you know, another song perhaps, a sermon with a reading. And nobody in the congregation ever said anything, whereas now we have lots of, let's read the Lord's Prayer together, let's say the Apostles' Creed together, let's do confession of sin and assurance of pardon together, and lots of reading aloud, which the Free Church people in the congregation all hated initially. But it meant that people coming from a Roman Catholic or Anglican background felt quite at home, and they thought, okay, this is not a cult, they're not a bunch of weirdos, this is familiar. So that was a wee bit of how context worked for us. Do the best we possibly can, and then provide things in the service that were familiar. And that's worked really well. We have a lot of people from those kind of backgrounds who come to the church. And the other thing that's really served as well is you just thinking about language all the time. Sort of a lot of churches speak in very insider language. It's like a club. We use jargon and we don't explain it. I mean, there's theological words that we always want to use and explain, but we don't just assume that everybody knows. We don't assume people know where things are in the Bible, or they know the story of Zacchaeus or Jonah and the whale or whatever. So just not making assumptions, using language that's really clear and accessible to the outsider, and always having the gospel at the centre of everything, because it's the gospel that transforms. So the gospel, as we would say, is the way in and the way on. That you become a Christian through hearing the gospel, and you grow as a Christian through hearing the gospel. So if we keep the gospel at the heart of everything that we're doing, then that serves evangelistically, but also it serves to kind of, as we would say, edify or nourish the believers who are in the church too. So it's been a great process. The church has grown from we started with 12. We launched the church when we had about 40 people. We have about 170 now or something like that. And we're just about to start another couple of congregations out of that. And St. Columba's, which is our mother church, have planted 2 other churches since they planted Cornerstone, and are about to plant another church as well. So we're just trying to get this kind of multiplying effect going on of starting lots of new things.
Yeah, and always with that ethos of what is the very local situation, wherever that church is going. It sounds like you really, as you were talking, remind me of the text where Paul says he became all things to all men, experimenting with different forms of liturgy, that you might be able to reach some of those people.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that text in Corinthians is fundamental to mission now. That kind of, 1 Corinthians 9, Paul is like, I'm absolutely flexible about how I do ministry, but I'm totally inflexible in the gospel. So I don't flex on the gospel, but I'll flex on anything else to reach those who need to be reached. And we're certainly in that situation now in Scotland, where people are really culturally distant from church, and especially my kids' age group and downwards, people in their early 20s and teens, very, very few have had any meaningful exposure to Christianity. So we have to think really smart about how we connect that generation to the gospel.
And what about it at the higher up level than that, in terms of the ability to reach people? Do you assume that because you've practiced this in growing your church now to the numbers it has, and you've reached people, so do you assume that they are looking for God, looking for the gospel, looking for answers, or do you assume that they aren't, and you just ask them and then you kind of expect God to sort of zap them with the gospel? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. I think we assume that people are totally disinterested because they are. We did a big survey of the Scottish population in 2014, a report called Transforming Scotland, and we used a polling organisation and did a population survey. 76% of Scots said Christianity was irrelevant to them. It's not like they didn't like it, but they just didn't think about it. It's like I pass a croquet club on my way to work quite often. I've never passed a croquet club and thought, oh man, croquet's fascinating, I'd love to go in and have a shot. It's irrelevant to my life, and that's the way church is to the vast majority of Scots. And people generally are still well disposed to church. They think church is a good thing, it helps people, it does good, but it's just not for them. So most of what we do is just about building relationships with people over the longer term, getting to know people, your neighbours, your colleagues, the people you meet at the school gate, whatever it might be, and just getting to know them, sharing your faith as you get opportunity, connecting them. We do a lot of kind of connecting events, just where people can begin to meet other Christians. And if you've got a non-Christian friend, just invite them to come and watch football or something with a few other Christians, so that you're not the only Christian they know, and they begin to feel part of things. And we found that if somebody comes into Cornerstone who doesn't know anyone, the chances of them coming back are really slim, you know. But if they come to Cornerstone and they've already met half a dozen people from the church, you know, socially, you know, going out for a drink or watching football or playing sports or whatever, if they come to church eventually and they know 6 or 7 of us and they've met me, oh, there's Neil, how you doing? They're far more likely to stick with us, you know. And so that just web of kind of relationships, inviting people into community, you know. So when we invite people to church, we're not inviting them to a service. We're inviting them into a community. And I think that's a really good distinction to keep in your head, that it's not all about Sundays. You know, it's much more about what we're getting on with through the week and how we're connecting to people. And we run the church actually with very few activities so that people have got time to spend with non-Christians instead of being at church every evening running stuff. We say, we want you to be out with your colleagues or your neighbours, getting to know them and connecting them to things. So that served us pretty well. I mean, we're not amazing at anything. If you came to Cornerstone, you'd find a pretty average church doing pretty average things. But we're trying to keep that intention of just moving outwards all the time. So
yeah, I can't help but feel though that, you know, there's a great rediscovery of pretty average church doing, you know, an average job of presenting the gospel, but inch by inch that grows the kingdom of God, and long may it continue. What about COVID-19? How have you guys had to react to that? We have a huge amount of variation across the Church of Scotland itself. How's it been for the Free Church and for Cornerstone?
So I think it's been really hard to gauge for the denomination. I think some of our smaller rural congregations, it was more difficult to get everything online. You know, I mean, and then I've got lots of guys in my church who are very good at tech, you know, so we got online quickly and everything worked really well. For smaller and more rural congregations, some of that's been really difficult. I think a lot of our churches are not back meeting in person yet, so we've got no idea really who's going to come back to church and who isn't. But we anticipate there's going to be a fall off in a lot of our congregations of people who, church was a habit, but it wasn't a passion, and they've got out of that. I mean, I think most of our churches will say they've had some new people connecting online. So online seems to be an easy new entry point for some people to church. So we've had some of that at Cornerstone. We ran a Christianity Explored course with a few new people who joined us online, and we did Christianity Explored with them online. So that's been good. I think tracking people pastorally has been the hardest thing. You know, that there's a lot of hard stuff happening to people during COVID-19. And just the sheer difficulty of seeing people and pastoring them has been really frustrating for me a lot of the time. But I've done a lot of walking. Let's go for a walk, you know, and just catching up with people that way. But I'm pretty convinced that across the board, in whatever denomination we are, we're going to see a lot of pastoral need come out of this. You know, people who've run into relationship and marital difficulties, people who've had a lot of anxiety through lockdown, people who've lost their jobs, people who've taken a big financial hit, people who are struggling with debt because of it. So mental health, financial, marital stuff, I think there's going to be a lot of tidying up and caring that needs to be done on the other side of this. And that's one of the things I think we can do now, is sort of prepare ourselves as well as we can. And we've spent a lot of time just building pastoral systems that work in a virtual environment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it sounds like from what you're saying that there might well be a tsunami of need for that pastoral system when the time comes and we eventually get through to whatever the end of this looks like, the immediate crisis. What about yourself personally? What's this making you through the whole pandemic? I'm sure if you're anything like me, you'll have had a good deal of confusion through it all. Certainly it's quite difficult without a roadmap, but what are you reflecting on, and what is perhaps ministering to you at the moment through all of this?
So, I mean, I was totally bewildered at the start of this, you know, like just trying to get church online the first few weeks I found really stressful. Suddenly I'm broadcasting from my living room, and that was a bit disorientating. And then I had quite a sweet period because as a minister, you're out a lot of the time, and evenings are busy, and my wife has a job where she's out a lot in the evening. So we didn't, we're one or other of us will be out most evenings of the week. And suddenly we were together every evening and going for walks together every day. So that aspect of it was great for me, that, we had a really nice time as a couple. And then over the summer, I think I just began to think, what's this going to look like going forward for us as a church? And I was saying to you earlier before we started recording that I felt really lost as a leader. I've been in church leadership for a long time, and I just said to God, I do not know how to lead in this situation. I've got no idea what I'm doing. And I really just had to get on my knees and say, God, show me the way ahead. And part of that then has just been, I think, sort of saying, try to help my congregation think about mission. What does mission look like in this situation? How do we keep witnessing for Jesus and talking about Jesus? And part of it has been working with the congregation and the leadership of the congregation to think about what's mission going to look like post-COVID, so that we can kind of get up and running fairly quickly, just doing a lot of preparatory work that way. The other thing that resonated with me a lot with COVID and the lockdown and so on was just how disruptive it was of our lives and the patterns of our lives. And I was doing a lot of reading towards the end of last year on what it means to live in a secular world where even for us as Christians, it feels like God is absent. So we believe, but, feeling that God's really close and near, is hard even for most Christians and just unthinkable to most secular people. So how do we have a sense of the presence of God in our world was one of the questions that I was really wrestling with anyway. And how do we show a sense of that presence to those who are not believers? And a lot of the reading I was doing in regard to that was just about reforming habits of the Christian life around prayer, Bible reading, community, how we manage our lives digitally, taking Sabbath as a rest and walking with God and rest and so on. And COVID actually gave a chance for me to think, well, what do these new habits look like? Because we're all changing our habits. Can we change them for good? So we did a lot of teaching over the summer around what we called habits of hope. What are the habits that are going to draw us nearer to Jesus and build a sense of hope in us in a really difficult season of life? So personally, that's been good for me, just thinking about the habits of my life and how do I learn to live with more of a sense of God's presence, that I'm living life out before his face.
Yeah, and sounds like you've been, really preaching to yourself through that and over the summer as well, and that you're part of the community as well, and you need all the messages as much as anyone. So I totally resonate with that. What about the examples you've seen of, you were saying that, the arm of the church that you're in that looks to do church planting, it looks to look out beyond the free church and work with others. What examples have you seen of that working well? Because presumably going forward after COVID-19, given we might have that great fall off, there might be an opportunity, probably a positive one, to work across different lines and boundaries more than ever for the kingdom. So where have you seen that work, and what hope do you have it'll continue?
So we've had a lot. Edinburgh's been really a great place to do ministry. There's a lot of different kinds of churches, Church of Scotland, Baptist, Episcopalian, Charismatic and Pentecostal churches. And in that, there's a lot of goodwill. People cheer each other on. There's a lot of kindness. People speak well of each other and try to build each other up as much as possible. So it's a really nice environment to be part of. And we've had help from all kinds of churches. As we've planted other churches, we've had support financially and in other ways from Baptist churches and different kinds of congregations. And with the church planting network, which we've got, which is called Generation, we've helped start some Baptist churches. We've provided training and support for Baptist and independent guys who are planting churches. And then we had a meeting about 3 or 4 weeks ago online with an organisation that I'm involved with called Transform in Scotland, who produced that report on the state of Christianity in Scotland. And We had a gathering of church plant network leaders from Scotland, and we were just looking at what networks there are in Scotland, what are they up to, where are people planting churches, how are they planting churches, and trying to map that out, what's going on in Glasgow, Edinburgh, what's going on in the north of Scotland. But not only how do you map it out, but how do we learn from each other? Where can we strengthen each other? Where does collaboration happen? So that was a really great meeting, very encouraging. There's quite a lot of Church Scotland people involved through a guy called Alan McWilliam in Glasgow, and he's got a network called Forge, so they do quite a lot of church planting in different places. And then there's Baptist, Charismatic, ourselves. So it's a really nice thing, a lot of the independent African churches as well. So that conversation is happening, and I think it'll be a really amazing conversation to have over the next year or two, because some churches are not going to come back from COVID. Some churches are going to not reopen, but there'll be buildings that might be used to start new things. So it's like, if some stuff dies, how do we come along and bring new things? Because we do want to see a gospel church for every community and neighbourhood in Scotland. And so where things don't survive COVID, can we come alongside and help start something new? And there's nobody can do this on their own. We need great partnership and collaboration. I mean, I think the Church of Scotland has got the most important part to play. It's got a reach and a resources that no other group or denomination can match. So a healthy, thriving, flourishing Church of Scotland is in everybody's best interests. But the rest of us want to play our part in that as well, and work alongside and learn from each other.
Yeah, and I think that's great that as much as we have that great inheritance, that we are now able to see, look across the country and see how much we can learn from your passion and enthusiasm for church planting and mission, and returning to something that is just determined to get the gospel into every corner of the country. So it's and I think as well, what I liked about what you said was just that despite the disruption and the negativity of COVID-19, is it could be a springboard for a new era of mission in Scotland, and here's hoping and praying that is the case. Tell me a bit about the Old Schoolhouse project.
Good. Yeah. I mean, on what you said, he is the God who brings good out of bad.
Yeah.
He's the God who turns things on their head. And this is, COVID is a disaster at many levels, but we've got to hope that God is going to do something great out the other side of it. We have a building that was gifted to us by a brethren congregation called the Old Schoolhouse. It was the original school in Morningside, and it was built in 1823. It was a school for 50 years. Thomas Chalmers preached there, and people like that back in the day. And there was a brethren church met there for about 100 years, but they were very elderly and kind of run out of energy. So they were shutting down just when we were starting. So they gifted that building to us as long as we promised to preach the gospel every Lord's Day. So we agreed to that one condition and have stuck to it. And we were given a very historic, iconic building right opposite Waitrose. And if you know Morningside, you know that Waitrose is like the key to community life. So it's a great building and a great location. It needed a lot of TLC. It's 200 years old, the building. It needed a lot of care. So we're just coming to the end of a sort of project where we've demolished part of the building and rebuilt it, and refurbishing the interior and getting everything kind of ready for 21st century community ministry, making it a hub for the community, making it a place where we can train people and send them out to church plant, and place where we can have our congregations meet and where we can stream stuff. So we've bought a lot of new tech as well for future kinds of ministry. So it's gone great. We have an amazing set of architects and some great builders on site, and they're doing a really good job for us.
Yeah. So, it's really exciting, and I love that just the old to the new, the fact that you're retaining this beautiful building of character, but you're repurposing it for 21st century ministry, which is just amazing.
Yeah, it is a lovely building, and we really want to kind of prize that and sort of we see ourselves as stewards of the building for the community, that this has been entrusted to our care, and we want to honour that. One of the really nice things is about the whole story is that the Brethren people prayed for years and years for children in the neighbourhood and longed for lots of kids to come to their church. And they never saw that prayer answered at that point. But within about a year of us taking over the building, we had 40 or 50 kids coming to the church, you know. And so their prayer was answered, not in the way that they anticipated, but just through their generosity to us. So it's been a really lovely part of the story. And we still see some of these Brethren people, some of them still come to the church, and their kindness to us is just remarkable.
Yeah, well, that's a wonderful example as well of just the kingdom, you know, passing on from one generation to the next. That's wonderful. Neil, I've been really grateful for your time, and I'm sure our people would have found this really interesting just to get insight into church life in a different part of the country. Can you tell us what we can pray for you and for your church in the coming days?
Great. Well, I still got a bit of money to raise, so you can pray that I raise the money I need for the building project. But much more importantly, we're trying to launch another congregation from Cornerstone in a part of Edinburgh called Gilmerton. So we're working on that next year. So that's our kind of next thing. But we're also trying to launch a Spanish language church as well next year. So we've got kind of 2 mission projects going on right now that I feel quite incapable of doing, but God can do. So praying for those 2 things, I think, would be really lovely. Just a church plant in a place called Gilmerton and a church plant amongst the Latino Spanish speakers of Edinburgh. If you prayed for those 2 things, that'd be amazing.
Will do, and we'll wait and see what God does through you and the good folks at Cornerstone, and look forward to it. So thank you very much, Neil. It's been a real pleasure, and God bless in all your work.
Great. Thank you. Absolutely delighted to be here.